She's 15. She used to raise her hand in class. She used to eat lunch in the cafeteria with everyone else. And then, somewhere in the last year, without any one big moment she could point to, she stopped. Now she eats alone. She says she's fine. Her parents think it's a phase. Her teachers think she's just shy. But she's not shy. Her heart is pounding before she even walks through the classroom door. Her stomach is in knots before she's said a single word to anyone. And here's the question that's about to change how we understand all of this. What if the reason she goes quiet in a room full of people isn't a personality trait at all? What if it's not really happening in her head? What if a part of it is happening somewhere lower, in her gut? That sounds like a stretch. It sounded like a stretch to the scientists too at first. But in December 2025, a research team in Shanghai published something that makes it very hard to dismiss. Let's back up. Social anxiety disorder isn't shyness. It's an intense, persistent fear of being watched, judged, humiliated in basically any social situation. And it usually shows up for the first time in adolescence, exactly when peer belonging matters most, and the cost of being left out feels highest. For a lot of people, it just gets called shy or sensitive for years before anyone gives it a real name. The standard treatments are therapy and medication, and they help for some people, but not for everyone, not even close. Researchers at the Shanghai Mental Health Center had been watching this for years. Treatment-resistant cases. Kids who did everything right, therapy, sometimes medication, and still didn't get better. If you've ever sat across from a therapist doing the homework, saying the right things, and still felt like nothing was actually changing, this next part might be why. Because a research team led by Jinghong Chen at Shanghai Jiao Tong University School of Medicine started asking a very different question. Not what's wrong with this person's thinking, but what's happening in their gut. This wasn't a random idea. It came from autism research. Scientists studying autism spectrum disorder had already found that gut bacteria seemed to play a real role in the condition. Not just a side effect, but something that looked causal. So the Shanghai team asked, could something similar be happening with social anxiety? Here's the thing about gut bacteria and the brain. They're not separate systems politely ignoring each other. There's a real physical communication line between your gut and your brain running both directions all the time. Scientists call it the gut-brain axis. It's been linked before to depression, to autism, but social anxiety specifically had barely been studied at all. So the team designed something more rigorous than just comparing two groups and noting a difference. They wanted to know, is this gut bacteria difference actually causing the anxiety? Or is it just something that happens alongside it, a symptom, not a cause? So what did they actually do to find out? They recruited 40 adolescents who had been diagnosed with social anxiety disorder and 32 healthy peers matched by age and gender. And they were strict about who qualified. Every teenager with social anxiety in the study was experiencing it for the first time, had no other psychiatric diagnoses, and had never taken any psychiatric medication. No noise in the data. Just the anxiety on its own. They collected stool samples from everyone and used genetic sequencing to map out exactly which bacteria were living in each person's gut. And they found a real difference. Teenagers with social anxiety had higher levels of a bacterial genus called Prevotella and lower levels of one called Parasittarella, compared to their healthy peers. But, and this is important, the difference was subtle, not the dramatic, sweeping shift you sometimes see in autism research. Subtle enough that the research team themselves were initially worried it wouldn't be enough to actually matter. So they ran the experiment that makes this study different from almost everything that came before it. They took the gut bacteria from the socially anxious teenagers and the gut bacteria from the healthy teenagers, and they transplanted them separately into newborn rats. not adult rats with their systems wiped clean by antibiotics like a lot of older studies did. Newborn rats, colonized from day one of life, the same way bacteria would naturally settle into a developing gut. The transplants continued daily until the rats reached adolescence. Then came the tests. An open field test to see if the rats avoided open space the way an anxious animal does. An elevated plus maze to see if they avoided exposed areas. And a 3-chamber social test to see how they responded to other rats, a stranger versus one they'd already met. And the rats that received bacteria from the anxious teenagers behaved differently. They spent less time in the open center of the field. They avoided the exposed arms of the maze more often. And in the social test, they didn't show the normal preference for investigating an unfamiliar rat over one they already knew, a small but telling sign of altered social processing. Bacteria transplanted into an animal that had never met a single human, that had never experienced a single moment of social judgment. And that animal still ended up behaving like it was anxious. Have you ever been told your anxiety is just in your head? Like it's something you should simply be able to think your way out of? This is one of the first pieces of hard evidence that, for at least some people, that framing might be incomplete. The researchers didn't stop at behavior. They looked inside the rats' brains, specifically the medial prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for regulating emotion and processing social information, and they found measurable chemical differences there too. Changes in metabolites, including lower levels of beta-carotene, and shifts in specific amino acids. The decline in that Parasudorella bacteria was linked to changes in how the body processed cholesterol and bile acids, chemical effects that traced all the way from the gut into the brain region tied to social fear. This is the part that matters most. It's not just anxious kids have different gut bacteria, it's take that bacteria, put it into a brand new animal with no history, no environment, no social experience at all, and you get anxiety-like behavior, and you get a matching chemical fingerprint in the brain. That's the difference between a correlation and a real, demonstrated functional link. One of the researchers, Junyu Lai, put it simply, the most significant takeaway is that social anxiety disorder appears to have a distinct biological footprint in the gut. Not the whole story, ego footprint, real, but partial. Now here's where I want to slow down because this is exactly the point where these stories usually get oversold. And this one doesn't have to be, because the actual researchers were careful enough to tell us exactly what this isn't. This isn't a cure. There is no supplement, no probiotic, no gut reset you can buy right now that treats social anxiety. The researchers were explicit about this. They identified a community-level effect, but they have not yet pinpointed the exact bacterial strain or the exact chemical responsible. In their own words, they haven't found a magic pill. They know the community has an effect, but they don't yet know the exact key players. There are real limits here too. Every human participant in this study was a treatment-naive Han Chinese adolescent. We don't yet know if this holds for adults or for other populations entirely. And the researchers didn't measure the immune system or the stress response system in this study, both of which are very likely part of how a signal actually travels from the gut up to the brain. That part of the map is still blank. The researchers have already laid out where they're going next. First, narrowing down from the whole bacterial community matters to identifying the actual specific bacteria or metabolites responsible. Second, mapping the full pathway connecting gut to brain, whether that's through immune signaling, hormones, or some other route they haven't measured yet. And third, testing whether any of this holds up in bigger, more diverse populations beyond the specific group they started with. So if you came here hoping for a fix, I want to be honest with you. That's not what this is yet. What this is something quietly bigger than a fix. It's the first real evidence that for at least some teenagers, the panic, the racing heart, the inability to walk into a room, Some piece of that may be traceable to something physical, measurable, sitting in the gut. Not a character flaw, not something to just push through. A biological footprint with a chemical fingerprint to match. If you've ever had someone, a parent, a teacher, even yourself, treat your anxiety like it was a choice you were making, this is one small, early, honest piece of evidence that it might not have been a choice at all. That girl in the cafeteria eating alone, she's not broken and she's not weak. Somewhere inside her, there might be a conversation happening between her gut and her brain that neither she nor anyone around her ever knew was real. Science is just now starting to listen in on that conversation. We don't have the full transcript yet, but for the first time we know it's actually happening.
If this video gave you something to think about, something that made you see yourself or someone you know a little differently, that's exactly what this channel is built for. Hit the like and subscribe button, and drop a comment below if this helped.